Welcome to this webinar on the future of carbon markets. Thanks for joining despite the end of year rush that you must all be in. Why is it worthwhile looking into the future of carbon markets right now at this point in time? Well, that's because they are booming. They're booming at a time when the international rulemaking for them isn't quite finished. Although the net zero and the carbon neutrality pledges from different levels of government, but especially from the corporate world, keep coming, the world's governments have not yet resolved their conflicts of interest over the rules for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, even as it has celebrated its 5th anniversary. Most of you will know there are notionally two separate carbon markets, one where carbon credits are bought under regulatory obligations to reduce emissions, and another where carbon credits are bought voluntarily. Yet the reality is these two markets are actually very much intertwined. Countries' Paris Agreement contribution pledges, more commonly known as NDCs, nationally determined contributions, can also cover mandatory and non-mandatory emission reduction efforts, which complicates matters. And projects generating carbon credits might be within or outside the scope as defined by the NDC and of the NDCs. And all this leads to arguments about double counting of emission reductions and also about so-called corresponding adjustments. That's all highly technical, but let's state the big questions underlying all this are, will carbon markets under the Paris Agreement actually deliver real climate action? And will they deliver better climate action than under the Kyoto Protocol? And a second very important question is, will they create adequate flows of finance to serve the development of low-income countries? Now, crystal ball gazing has traditionally, historically been predominantly a female profession. Yet today we exceptionally rely on 5 male experts to enter this domain. First, we will hear from Guy Turner of Trove Research based in the UK, who will read the signs of the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets for us. This task force is more commonly known as the Mark Carney Task Force, after Mark Carney, who lent his name to this initiative and is a driving force. Second, we will benefit from the scrying of Aki Kachi of NewClimate Institute, who will look for signs that alternatives to carbon offsets could have a bright future. Then we have 2 members of the, shall I say, the carbon market establishment, who will have a go at telling its fortunes. A warm welcome to Owen Hewlett, Chief Technical Officer of Gold Standard, and David Antonioli of Verra, the CEO of the Verra Standard. And last but not least, we have an NGO wizard. We have Gilles Dufrasne, who will give us his interpretation of the signs in the ball, in the crystal ball. Before I hand over to these speakers, I have to make just a few housekeeping announcements. The first one is to please name yourself and include also the name of your organization. And if you so please, maybe also the country code so that we can get a sense of where people are calling in from. We have very widespread international participation today. You can do this by clicking on the 3 little dots in the top right corner and choose the rename option. And then you appear as such also in the participants list. Apart from the speakers, I'd like to ask the audience to keep their mic and video off. Given the short duration of this webinar, questions from the audience will be taken in writing. And may I ask you to use only the Q&A function of Zoom for this. We will take questions just for clarification after each presentation, and then questions for debate at the end. But by all means, post your questions throughout in the Q&A function. And please use the chat function, not for questions to the speakers. Please reserve the chat function just for comments and any information which you might throw in, which you might want to provide that we in particular can pick up on afterwards. Let it be also known that Carbon Market Watch will tweet about the event, and you're obviously welcome to respond to those tweets and help create a discussion around the subject. Our comms director, Kaiser, who is also the technical host of this meeting today, will post suitable hashtags in the chat. And finally, what I have to tell you is that this webinar is live streamed on Facebook, and you're also welcome to share the link from there. So now please enjoy the presentations, and our first speaker is Guy Turner from Trove Research to tell us something, the latest, the most interesting things about the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets. Over to Guy.
Thank you, Sabine. Am I coming through okay on sound and vision?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. So thank you, Sabine. I will just give literally about a 5-minute overview of the task force. I am personally not involved in the sort of central inner sanctum of it, but we have been involved in regular discussions with various participants. So we have a view from sort of the outside, and we have contributed to some technical work to look at the dynamics of the market. Really just a bit of history. The task force was created over the summer. It is a mammoth effort, actually, and it's a very impressive effort by Mark Carney and the Institute of International Finance and McKinsey, who've been running as the Secretariat. They have done an incredible amount of work in a very short space of time, partly to try and coincide with all of the work that needs to be done in the run-up to COP26. And I think we're all running on.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we don't actually see you anymore. Could you turn your camera on, please?
Beg your pardon. Sorry. And I just want to sort of give a quick overview of the timescales, some of the processes that they're running through, and some of the key issues that they're trying to address. In terms of timescales and process, and I would encourage anyone on the call to go to the IIF website, where there are the documents, the consultation documents have been published, and they're operating in a very transparent process. And to provide any further feedback that you may have on the documents that have been presented. They did actually end a consultation process on the first draft on the 10th of December. The results were presented a couple of days ago. And now they are running through just what they're calling a fatal flaw feedback. So they're coming to sort of a conclusion on their first draft of the consultation process. And that sort of final iteration of the feedback will be required by the 5th of January. There will be a final report then issued on the 27th of January and released for the timing to coincide with Davos. So I encourage everyone to be as actively involved in that consultation process as possible. The main issues, their remit has really been very broad. There is one issue which has sort of remained outside the task force's scope, and that is perhaps something we're going to deal with on this one, which is the linkage between the voluntary carbon market and the Paris Agreement and Article 6. The main focus of the task force has been what is needed to scale, bring capital to be deployed in low carbon projects throughout the world. They've broken their sort of work into various substreams. There's a work stream on governance. There's another one on what they're calling the core carbon principles. And that is an umbrella term for quite a few other sub-issues. They're also looking at market integrity, legal and accounting frameworks, what's needed to scale demand. So how are corporates, the voluntary carbon market, going to react and grow. So one of the main issues there is about claims and the type of different claims that companies are making and how that might influence the dynamics of the market. Supply side issues, potentially around Article 6 as well, but we have to draw sort of a boundary on that one. Market infrastructure, there's a lot of work has been done on that work stream. If the intention is to bring capital to the market, is to bring liquidity to the transaction space. And if we can get forward pricing on core carbon prices, that will bring liquidity, that will bring capital. That also comes with it when you start to deal in future exchanges. It starts to bring in a host of other regulatory issues around the control and regulation of financial markets. And then there are the sort of regulatory linkages that it's sort of another work stream is on regulatory linkages beyond that. That might sound like all a bit of a bit of a mouthful, but some of the most interesting and sort of intractable areas that they've had to deal with so far have been around the core carbon principles, grappling with issues such as should there be decisions around the eligibility of different project types, potentially vintage cutoffs like we've seen in Corsia, and the thorny issue of governance. And there's a sort of a very interesting debate going on around whether the market is best served by continuing with a decentralized world where the standard setting bodies and the accreditation processes that currently exist are the best way to go, or whether there needs some kind of oversight and more coordinated or centrally sort of governed process. And in many of these areas, the task force has yet to conclude, and I suspect there won't be conclusions until next year. This is, I think, the overall ambition to start with might have been slightly misplaced, and I think they're finding that the diversity of opinion is so great that the initial recommendations will be signposts towards conclusions maybe in 2021. That's my interpretation, but that's just what I'm seeing from the outside. So there's a lot of work to do, and I think David and other people on the call will also have their interpretations of how the task force is progressing. But I think it's definitely a very healthy process and will provide ultimate clarity on some of the issues, but not all.
Thank you very much, Guy. That was a very good overview, and good to know that even with the final report, it's not the final word spoken, that it's very clear that a lot needs to still be resolved in the course of 2021. Interesting, though, that the report is timed to be published with the World Economic Forum in Davos. So there's clearly, there is the desire to create an effect on the investors that will be present in Davos. I don't see questions for you in the chat at this moment, which means that clarification is not required for now, but I'm sure people are just digesting what they've listened to, and they will be generating questions for the debate later on. Then for now, let's move on to Aki Kachi from NewClimate Institute. Aki, you were commissioned by Carbon Market Watch to look into what we called results-based climate finance. You have produced a study for us. Tell us how you see this idea of results-based climate finance as an alternative to traditional offsets in the Paris era. And I see Aki has some slides for us.
Thank you, Sabine. Thank you, guys. Very interesting to hear that update on the task force. We've taken a particular sort of slant on what role voluntary markets can play, and much more as sort of a results-based finance mechanism. I'll just run through a quick presentation of those results. Just very briefly, the end of 2020 brings and marks a transition from Kyoto to Paris. I mean, Paris was maybe 5 years ago, but the real start of the Paris Agreement is basically now, with the end of the second Kyoto commitment period, where we go from a world where really only only industrialized countries had emission reduction targets. And flexibility mechanisms, mainly the CDM, were originally designed to help industrialized countries reach those targets. And within that flexibility, to also assist non-Annex 1 parties or developing countries with achieving sustainable development and contributing to the ultimate objective of the convention. But Article 6 is designed or is phrased to play a very different role than the CDM in particular under the Paris Agreement. And it's a new context in that now all countries have set emission reduction targets in the form of nationally determined contributions. And this flexibility mechanism of Article 6 is explicitly there to allow for higher ambition in mitigation and adaptation actions, and to promote sustainable development and environmental integrity. That transition, where we go from a world where only developed countries had targets to a world where all countries have targets, means that, first of all, the scope of activities not subject to targets is shrinking and decreasing. So not all NDCs cover all emissions of all countries. But the idea is that under the Paris Agreement, all countries are supposed to rapidly increase the scope of their NDCs to cover all emissions, and that all countries need to rapidly peak and decline their emissions in order to reach the overall temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. And right now, or most NDCs were submitted before the Paris Agreement was actually agreed. So when putting forward their targets, countries didn't really know exactly what Article 6 or the Paris Agreement would actually look like. So right now, it's determining what is inside and outside the scope of an NDC is rather complicated in many cases. And so it's also hard to understand to what extent voluntary markets go beyond what would have happened under the implementation of an NDC. And it's also important to remember that these NDCs are dynamic. The first NDCs were put forward in 2014, 2015. Countries were supposed to all have put forward new NDCs this year. Some have, not all. Those that have not are expected to soon. And also, countries can also update their NDC at any time. So they don't have to stick to this 5-year target or time schedule, but they're supposed to update their NDCs at least every 5 years. Thinking about that, what kind of requirements do we see are necessary to guarantee especially environmental integrity with carbon markets and their relation to NDC? And basically, we have the view that only 2 models are really future-proof going forward. NDC crediting, which is akin to classical offsetting, but where you would have a corresponding adjustment and the country would clearly say, we will not use this reduction towards our targets. And a contribution claim, where one can contribute or claim to have contributed financially towards emission reduction in a country, but one would not claim the ownership of that reduction towards one's own targets. And I think there's going to be a bit more of a discussion about these different models later in the webinar. But just for everyone to know, we're focusing on really this contribution claim or the finance claim in terms of what we're talking about here. And we see this as a form of results-based finance. In terms of results-based finance and the voluntary market, as I said, we see it as something that implies support without a balancing out of one's own carbon footprint. That excludes a claim of carbon or climate neutrality. And it would be parallel to a claim where one has supported someone else to achieve sustainable development co-benefits, such as clean water access or enhancing biodiversity. Because one is not counting this or netting out one's own carbon footprint, we don't see a double claiming risk, as long as we're really not using it as a classical offset. I think this is a bit of a difference because much of the market has become accustomed to thinking about net zero targets, and many countries, companies, individuals are thinking about their net footprint. And so a shift towards accepting that one has one's own carbon footprint or climate footprint, towards and not netting that out, but rather kind of accepting that but also seeing that one has a responsibility and has the option to help others reduce their carbon footprint, was going to require a shift and a concerted effort to get the correct framing and mobilize stakeholders to really maximize that impact. And we see it a danger in the extent that offsetting may be cheaper, it may than internal reductions in one's own carbon footprint, that it may distract from efforts to reduce one's own emissions if one can do it externally in a cheaper way. But so in making the shift, which is, we see, as I said, one of the two viable models, there are various important stakeholders, I think, that we need to bring along. Standards, with whom we're speaking today, developers, UNFCCC negotiators, regulators, donors, which can range from governments to civil society groups, to businesses, to individuals, and then really sort of the civil society NGO space, such as Carbon Marker Watch, who is actively participating in these debates. And even with the switch from offsetting towards a financing reduction claim, we see an issue that the CO2e metric, which is basically results-based finance in general, will still lead to focus on the cheapest mitigation options and not necessarily those where host countries need the most help to drive technological change and increase ambition. And it's not exactly buying away the low-hanging fruit from those countries, because you're not asking for that corresponding reduction, but it's not necessarily the mitigation options where those countries need the most help. And the fact that results-based finance, basically a project developer gets the finance ex post, or really where they have already achieved the mitigation reductions, means that there's a bias towards reliable, proven, reliable twice there, but reliable and proven technologies, where the project developer is not taking a major risk, and they know exactly that the reductions will be achieved. And this also provides a bias against smaller developers that may not be able to overcome the initial costs of investment to achieve those reductions. At the same time, dispersing finance just as some kind of normal donation or not results-based finance versus results-based finance also comes with various transaction costs. Importantly, to design or think about what kind of baseline we're reducing from, and that the degree of accuracy in terms of monitoring, reporting, and verification, obviously depending on the technology and methodology, but to the extent that these are transaction costs that could otherwise be spent on actually carrying out the action, that may represent lost finance that could be going to actual mitigation itself. This is also a important debate in the markets community, but we see it as quite problematic to reduce emissions where there wouldn't have been emissions to reduce. And this is often the case, especially for least developed countries that are not significant emitters. And so we don't see results-based finance as necessarily the best channel for least developed countries, where problematic assumptions of suppressed demand are used currently in carbon markets to inflate baselines. We see development finance as really something separate than carbon finance and results-based finance. And to the extent that that emphasis on carbon dioxide equivalence is really the focus of results-based finance, there's been a mixed track record in terms of prioritization of sustainable development co-benefits vis-a-vis CO2 reductions. That has a bit to do with the transparency of markets, and it's a bit better in voluntary markets than in compliance markets, but it's often a mixed record. There's some possible solutions to the extent that there's an option to put the emphasis on quality and not on quantity. In specific countries and with specific technologies, we can really also target results-based finance towards specific technologies that are more likely to foster technology transfer and sectoral transitions. In some cases, this will mean that finance providers need to be prepared to take higher risk for projects that may have a higher transformational impact. There are opportunities to look for streamlining to reduce transaction costs. And to the extent that we're not using these credits or these finance claims as offsets, I think there may be some space to reconsider exactly how demanding we need to be with baseline estimations in MRV if it's not being used to compensate for increased emissions or ongoing emissions elsewhere. This would, however, require very clear separation from offsetting mechanisms, because then there's a risk of environmental integrity or undermining environmental integrity. In cases, we think that there are very promising opportunities, especially for larger buyers, and to some extent these are countries dispersing climate finance through carbon markets. To some extent, these are also companies that now actually have very large commitments to disperse climate finance. One can also work with governments to integrate measures into their NDCs and national policies after a certain period or at the end of a crediting period. This is, for example, something that the German government has done with the nitric acid climate action group, where the German government said that they would buy a certain number of CDM credits from nitric acid projects, with the agreement that the host country would integrate that into their national policies after 2020. And to the extent that the projects, the initial investments in projects may constitute a significant barrier towards project development, especially public donors may consider making complementary enabling measures such as loan or grant schemes to preparatory measures where upfront costs present as a significant barrier. This to some extent has been done under the CDM. We see a much larger need for that going forward. And in cases where there are not a lot of emissions to reduce, we see alternatives being developed. Verra and Gold Standard both have been working on increased benefits, and especially the African Development Bank has been working quite a bit on what they call an adaptation benefit mechanism, where one can channel finance towards results-based outcomes that are not CO2 or not using CO2 as a metric, and therefore do not need to inflate baselines in order to achieve that outcome. And just sort of looking into the larger landscape of climate finance, we see a clear niche for results-based finance. And as I said, there are some challenges for really early stage technologies in the research and development stage, where when it's not sure how many emissions will be reduced with the finance. But those may be really the essential technologies, the breakthrough technologies that we need to be moving countries onto a sectoral transition. And on the other hand, we have a mature market where we have mature technologies that are really deployable and financially and economically competitive, where we're not additional either as carbon markets or as results-based finance, where market rate loans or to some extent concessional loans may make sense. And so we see results-based finance as really sort of a subset of grant finance in the overall landscape of climate finance, where we're sitting in a sort of comfortable space between really early stage research and development and mature technologies. And that's just a brief overview of our current thinking. I'm happy to take questions and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Aki. I see comments on what you have said in the Q&A, but no questions as such. I think I'll let you pick up the comments at your leisure for the discussion later. What I'd like to highlight at this point is that you use the term results-based climate finance, but there are many alternative terms out there. There isn't a settlement on the terminology to use yet. There's also the term climate contribution claims or NDC support units. But what is clear is that we're looking at a new product, that we're nevertheless looking at something that will be a product in the carbon market, something that will have a protocol to create it. There will be an accreditation for it. It will be something viable, something sellable. And actually the critical issue for the creation of such a product and for such a product to take hold in the market is precisely to create a new standard for it, to create labels for it. And as far as I'm informed, Gold Standard, from whom we'll be hearing next, is already in the business of developing such labels. I'm not aware that Verra, who will be speaking afterwards, is, but what we're in for now is to hear from the two standards what the prospect is for turning this idea of results-based climate finance into actual products on the market. So on that note, over to Owen Hewlett from Gold Standard.
Thanks, Sabine. Can you hear me okay before I dive in? Yeah, I'm good. So hi, everybody. Thanks to Carbon Market Watch for the platform, and thanks to all of you for joining. Thanks also, Aki, for setting the scene there, the majority of which I really agree with. And I think the move towards either a correspondingly adjusted offset model or a market-based, results-based finance model is the conclusion that I drew personally and Gold Standard drew at a policy level this year. And I think I'll explain how we got to that point, because I think along the journey, you'll see how we also do some scrying into the future on how these things might work. So the first thing to say is that one of the big themes that we see in markets over the last couple of years is a diversification of application, by which I mean, when we speak about markets, what we really mean is, what are we using them for, is starting to fragment and diversify along a number of lines. So Aki already pointed out that historically we've had fairly siloed CDM and fairly siloed voluntary markets. Already we now have a market-based mechanism that will emerge for country-to-country transfers. We have CORSIA for a sectoral compliance use of voluntary standards like ours and David's. We have a South Africa carbon tax as a domestic compliance instrument. We have general voluntary offsetting, which Aki talked about too. And we now talk about a kind of market-based finance model. And there will be others. And the point there is to say that one of the things I like in the task force is this development of core principles, which we take as a signal to mean all of those applications of markets and the units that serve them at some level should be consistent on those core attributes, like additionality, like baseline, etc., needing a methodology, needing to be assured properly. And then what you have is almost variable provisions that take that core unit and make it make sense in the application it's used for. So CORSIA has done this to some extent already. If you think about CORSIA's restrictions on vintage and project type and its requirement for a corresponding adjustment, those would be different to what South Africa requires in terms of location. You know, obviously you need to be in South Africa to be in the South African carbon tax scheme. So you can already see some of those variable provisions coming into play. And the way we will approach that is that we will have a consistent asset and then consistent approaches to key variable provisions. And credits in our registry will be flagged according to what their attributes allow them to do. And I think maybe just where I slightly depart from what you said, Sabine, is I do see it as a new application. I don't necessarily see it as a new asset, in the sense that you could actually use an adjusted unit for results-based finance, right? In fact, that would be quite powerful if you did it and didn't use it as an offset. It would be quite a powerful mechanism. And so we may see credits go on a journey of getting to grips with these variable provisions and go from being only suitable for one application to several. And you would imagine project proponents will want that maximal flexibility. Just in terms of the corresponding adjustment and offset model versus results-based finance model in voluntary markets. So the reason we draw the conclusion we did there is all about the double claiming that Aki mentioned. And double claiming, I think it's worth, because this does confuse people. And I think it confuses people because a corresponding adjustment resolves a problem when you transfer between countries, but resolves a different problem when you're talking about voluntary offsetting. So it's the same solution, but a different problem. And I think that's really important because it confuses people. I hear a lot of arguing from, well, we don't cause country to country double counting, so it's not an issue. That's certainly important. No mechanism should cause country to country double counting. That certainly would be a problem, but it's not the problem that we have in voluntary offsetting generally. The problem we have with double claiming with voluntary compensation mechanisms is that if I emit +1 into the atmosphere and I buy a credit to -1 somewhere else, that should be no net worse off. But if the second claimant takes that -1 and says, oh, I can now defer a policy or an action or change my behavior because I'm getting a good signal against my target over in that sector, then they put a +1 back into the equation and suddenly we're making things worse. And if you don't think that's true, the UK government last week announced on the same day within a couple of hours, and I'm sure this was intentional, that there would be a domestic voluntary offsetting scheme of, merging the existing woodland carbon code and the Great North Peat Bog, which sounds delightful. And within hours of that, they'd also announced a major piece of infrastructure for the Thames crossing. And the major criticism of that Thames crossing is that it's out of sync with the net zero, the legally obliged net zero target of the UK. So it's anecdotal, but if you're telling me they didn't know what they were doing by announcing those things on the same day, then I think we're in the wrong conversation. And so we have to resolve that. So any solution to that problem either has to take away the double claim itself, or the possibility that one or another is doing a +1 in their equation. And so corresponding adjustments removes the possibility of the double claim. It takes away that second +1 potential. The results-based finance effectively removes the philosophy of the -1 for the offset. It doesn't treat it as a -1, just something it's supporting. And I think that's why, and that's how we settled on this. I would say that although all of that is technically sound and true, there does need to be a thoughtful transition to that world. None of us can just flick a switch and make that happen immediately. The infrastructure is emerging, but isn't ready yet. And so we need to be protective of vulnerable projects. But it is true, and it is what we're moving towards. Maybe because I've got a minute, I think, left in my 7, just to go through some of the arguments against that position and see if they're sound. If you take the test, does it remove the double claim, or does it make the second claimant less likely to behave badly? Some of the arguments we hear, so there's an argument from additionality. If the unit is additional, then it doesn't matter. Well, clearly that doesn't remove the potential for double claim, and it would assume the second claimant would need to know your definition of additionality, know the unit was additional, agree with you, and act accordingly, which just seems incredibly unlikely. We hear a lot of arguing from a need for finance, and I certainly have sympathy with that, but needing finance doesn't take away the double claim. It doesn't take away the possibility that you raise or change your behavior elsewhere. We hear an argument a lot that it's a compliance issue, not a voluntary issue. Well, again, like additionality, that would mean the second claimant would need to know it was a voluntary signal, agree with that, and act accordingly, which just seems very unlikely. And if anything, actually, I would say compliance schemes are probably better in this regard with their transparency and kind of recognition and oversight. So actually, I would say, if anything, it's a worse problem in voluntary than it is in compliance. And then lastly, we hear the argument from Paris isn't legally binding, therefore we shouldn't interfere. But I don't think that really matters. Like a target being legally binding or not doesn't change how, or doesn't influence how the second claimant might behave. I mean, it might influence it in some way, but it doesn't remove the possibility that they'll behave badly. But in any event, you know, the UK does have a legally binding target. It is legislated, and so does the EU, and so do many other countries. And more will over time, and many of the sectors covered will have legal obligations over time as well. So in short, applications diversify and fragment. Units will be a bundle of attributes. Some are mandatory, some will be variable, and it's the variable ones, I think, that will end up dictating which market and application you're fit to serve. And yeah, very much agree that the variable of is it okay to double claim with the host country or anybody else? If you toggle that variable, then it takes away or allows or takes away the mechanism to be compensatory. So I'll pause there because that's a lot of stuff to download already. Yeah.
Indeed, I feel quite overwhelmed with everything you have explained, Owen. I thought you would concentrate more on your efforts of creating a label for results-based climate finance, but thanks nevertheless for having presented such a differentiated picture. Well, now I'm very keen to hear where David Antonioli from Verra differs from Owen Hewlett, whether you have fundamentally a different vision of what Owen just set out. David, over to you.
Great, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to speak.
And by the way, to the audience, keep the questions coming in the Q&A section. We have only 2 questions for the moment. Okay. Sorry, David.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity to speak here today. Pleasure to be with everybody. And I'm going to really talk about 2 things. First, I'm going to take a step back and have us think about what drives the voluntary carbon market, and then set out what I think it could look like, kind of answering the question in the title of the webinar. But then I want to recap our consultation on scaling voluntary carbon markets and avoiding double counting, and getting into this debate about corresponding adjustments, because we don't necessarily see eye to eye. We agree with many of the things that that Owen has said, but not all of them. So this might lead to a good discussion. Next slide, please. So I think if we think about why the voluntary markets work today, let's just take a step back and think about that. The first thing that's driving these is that there's insufficient government action. The reason corporates are taking action on climate change is because the governments aren't stepping up and are not providing the confidence that everybody needs to know that the problem is under control. So that's what's driving all of this, is particularly the consumer-facing companies. They're feeling like, gee, my consumers will now want me to do this. And I think this is important because I think it has essentially changed the dynamic in terms of taking responsibility. And I think it's a great opportunity, and not just for climate, but for a number of other things in the future, particularly sustainable development targets, et cetera. But what we see is now companies are stepping up, they're measuring their footprint, and that essentially creates a liability, right? Whether you like it or you recognize it as such, that's essentially the reality. When you create when you measure your footprint, you're creating a liability, and you have to do two things with it. One, you have to reduce it, and ideally you do take measures internally to do so. And then some companies go beyond, say even the Science-Based Targets Initiative targets, and actually set up or compensate for the emissions by purchasing offsets. And I think critically, it's really important to think that the trading of assets to address business imperatives is what corporates do. And I'm going to come back to this because I think this is really important when we think about solutions like the ones proposed about contribution claims. So if we go to the next slide, please. I wanted to show this slide because this is a good one to illustrate how we see the evolution of crediting and projects, because I think there is the reality that as countries start to define what their NDCs really mean and translate those into actual regulations on the ground, we will start to see as standards and as a society that there will be more and more sectors that are covered by these regulations, which means that we need to be very careful about where we're crediting projects, right? So if you'll see on the slide, I like it because it illustrates, some of the leading ETSs around the world, what are the sectors that are covered? And most of them start with targeting the large emitters, the point sources. So the power sector, industry, buildings, transport, those are relatively easy, not that they're easy, but they're relatively easy to regulate versus some of the other sectors which tend to be more diffuse, such as forestry. Agriculture isn't even on this slide because it's hardly ever regulated, besides it being very politically difficult to do so. So the point of the slide is to illustrate that as governments start to regulate climate change and greenhouse gases more, which we all hope they do, that will reduce the scope of types of project activities that will be able to be accredited. And that's the kind of thing that we are certainly very conscious of. I know that Gold Standard is as well, and we're right to do so. And I actually think that our decision to no longer accept grid-connected renewable energy projects in most countries is a good indication of us staying ahead of that. So that's just a really important piece of that. But I think that as the markets evolve, I think for this reason, we'll see an increasing role for natural climate solutions because, again, the more diffuse sectors, forestry, agriculture, those sectors will be the last to be regulated. Once they get regulated, then you can't do a project, right? But until they get regulated, we think that there's plenty of room for them to participate in the global market, in the global voluntary market. And of course, within whatever schemes get developed, right, within countries to drive finance to these activities. Next slide, please. So I think beyond increasing focus on NCS, I think there will be a move towards project-based and jurisdictional RED. There's kind of an argument or a narrative out there that everything has to be jurisdictional when you're talking about RED, and we don't believe that. We put out a consultation on our jurisdictional and nested RED framework, and we're setting out rules and procedures for how you can actually bring these two together. We think that the way to address RED is by bringing these two worlds together and not keep them apart. We think it's a false dichotomy to say that you have to do one or the other, and they can work in tandem very well. And so we're doing a lot of work to make sure that that can happen. There will be an increasing focus on removals. I think that's probably the right thing in the long term. There's a lot of discussions and possibilities for technology-based removals. Whether those are getting close to reality is a different question, but I think they will be at some point. But I think it's really important that we not lose sight of the fact that we need to protect standing forests. If we lose standing forests, the hill to climb will be much steeper, and we will lose a huge amount of biodiversity. So we need to be careful not to kind of go all in and focus on removals and lose sight of making sure that we protect standing forests. I think the Sustainable Development Goals will be a key differentiator. Going back to what the Carney Task Force was talking about, there's this proposal to create these core carbon principles, and we're fully behind that. We think it's a great idea, but what that means is that beyond that, there will need to be some differentiator, because the voluntary market, I think, is characterized and will continue to be characterized by needing to differentiate or find specific projects that meet a certain narrative of a particular company. So I think one of the easiest way to think about that is doubling down and thinking about what the sustainable development contributions are of projects. So I think this will be a key differentiator going forward. And I think finally, the point I wanted to make is that, under the Paris Agreement, we're saying, well, let's try to meet 2 degrees, and let's try really hard to meet 1.5 degrees. We're living today in a world that has a 1 degree warming versus what we had in pre-industrial levels, and the consequences are devastating. Why should we stop at that? So I think I wanted to invite people in this webinar to think about, let's think about moving beyond 1.5 degrees. And if we think about that, there's a huge role for the voluntary market going forward. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk briefly about our consultation. This is a consultation we did from 18th of August through the 17th of October. We received a number of comments. We're still processing them. We don't anticipate many changes from what we put out, but I wanted to talk some of the basic elements of the consultation. If you go to the next slide, please. There's a recognition in there that there are now a range of markets, each with its own rules. You'll have CORSIA, we'll hopefully have Article 6 transactions, we have domestic markets, we have a number of different markets that will each require a certain set of rules. Buyers in the voluntary market will have different motivations and desired claims. Some of them like offsets, and very much so, and will continue to want offsets as we know them today. Some of them will be happy with financing claims, others will be happy with getting a corresponding adjustment. So the role of the standards is to ensure that the credits are credible. That means, as I mentioned before on that diagram I showed, that we need to stay ahead of what I call the additionality curve, right? Making sure that we're staying ahead and being on top of making sure that any credit is not required by regulation, which is, of course, one of the first tests that we look at when looking at the additionality behind a project. Transparency is key, and our proposal is to have our registry allow for the labeling of units based on the different requirements of markets. If we go to the next slide, please. On corresponding adjustments, now we're getting into the piece about, the part of the discussion here. I think it's really important to take into account that they are a construct of the Paris Agreement. They're meant to ensure that global emissions add up, and that this is taking into account reporting by countries. Owen, you mentioned this. That in respect of corresponding adjustments, corporates are on a different level, and we do agree, and I'll get into that in a second. But we believe that for compliance markets, whether it's Article 6 transactions, whether it's CORSIA or any future compliance markets that require cross-border trading that get reported at the national level, they should require corresponding adjustments, and hopefully the negotiations in Glasgow kind of get us there. However, we believe that for voluntary markets, corresponding adjustments should be optional. We need to remember that corporates are going beyond what governments ask them to do, and that the reporting does not get tallied at a national level. And I do think that that's a really critical piece of the pie or the puzzle to understand. If we go to the next slide, please. We think that there's 5 main reasons why we should not require corresponding adjustments for offsets. The first one is what I mentioned before, that these are separate or parallel accounting ledgers. The reductions reported by a corporate making a voluntary contribution to reduce its footprint beyond whatever it might have is a voluntary action that never gets reported to its host, to its country's account. So there's no undermining of the Paris Agreement accounting. I think importantly, if you do require corresponding adjustments, you're going to put developing countries at a huge disadvantage, because A, you're going to drive investment to local or domestic actions. So if you take the majority of the market today is being undertaken by companies operating in the global north. So those companies are investing in projects domestically, but also abroad. If you require a corresponding adjustment, you're going to drive that investment to go domestic, where you won't necessarily need a corresponding adjustment. So that's going to essentially dry up finance in places where it's needed the most. Second, well, the other point is, and you mentioned this, Owen, well, we can't do it now because we don't have the infrastructure to do so, right? And it's essentially kicking the can down the road. But then the question becomes, when do you require corresponding adjustments? We think that this is a very fraught question that you're going to have a hard time answering, because you're going to wrap yourselves in a number of debates and arguments about when is the right time, in which country, and how and when. And I think this needs to be resolved on the principles basis. The other point is that corporates actually may want to contribute to country NDCs. Many companies are very happy to contribute to the NDC of a country, and we don't see any problem with that. And then finally, the contributions claim, which Aki mentioned, I think has a real risk of undermining corporate ambition. So we did a consultation on this a few years back, and we proposed creating another unit. I think it was called the domestic climate contribution. And guess what? Corporates hated it. And they hated it because it doesn't allow them to make the claim that they want to make, that they're investing in a project that's helping to offset a liability, what I mentioned before, on their books. So it removes the rationale for carbon offsetting. It also returns us to the world of corporate philanthropy. So all of a sudden you're saying, well, actually, let's go back to the world where we rely on corporates to do the right thing, but you're undermining and taking away a very powerful rationale that's helping to drive additional financing to this problem. And it would therefore likely reduce investment. If we go to the next slide, please, this is my last one. I think there are some concerns about not requiring corresponding adjustments. The first one is about double claiming, and a lot has been said, and much of the debate is driven by that. But I wanted to point out that double claiming is happening already right under our noses. So if you think about a company that's reducing its emissions internally, let's take a company that's distributing goods through a country, has warehouses, right? So maybe they're investing in renewable energy efficiency, and they're buying electric vehicles to distribute all the goods that they're doing. Guess what? Even if they have a science-based target, they're reducing their emissions. And you know what? They're claiming those reductions. And yet, the country where all this is happening is also seeing those benefits happen to them. And they're accruing those benefits. So this idea of letting this double claiming lead us down the pathway of requiring corresponding adjustments, I think is highly problematic. I think you can address this very transparently by just asking or requiring corporates to be clear about the claims they're making. So for example, a corporate could easily say that for the purposes of accounting under the Paris Agreement, the emission reductions or removals accrue to the host country. The other argument that gets used a lot is that this is going to undermine host country ambition. And I think this argument actually cuts both ways. I think you could easily argue that if countries know that they're going to have to make a corresponding adjustment, they're just going to lowball their NDCs. So I'm very skeptical about these arguments that make huge conclusions about what the incentives are when there's a number of different factors at play. There's no evidence to say that projects undermine country ambition. And there's better, more direct ways of enhancing ambitions. You know, countries we can work on putting teeth into the Paris Agreement. We can put public pressure on countries to raise their ambition. It's all very transparent, and we can all see what countries are signing up to. But we shouldn't use a tool that's not meant to do that, to kind of as a cudgel to beat up on a system that's actually working quite well and can expand and can grow and actually drive a lot more climate ambition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. What a wealth of thought and information here. I think in terms of clarification, we can maybe take one question which was posted in the chat. You just said that climate contribution claims would undermine corporate ambition, and I don't think everybody fully got that. The notion is that a move away from offsets and from netting what companies do, from throwing in own emission reductions and offsetting into one, so to speak, would enhance transparency. It would focus attention on what companies are doing in the first instance on reducing their own emissions. So why should it reduce? Why should it undermine corporate ambition? Could you clarify that again?
Yeah, sure. So let me just say first that, you know, our consultation sets out that it's companies who have to decide what they want. So the contribution claim may work for some corporates, and that's great. Some corporates may want corresponding adjustment, and that's great as well. But we fear that if you require a corresponding adjustment, which today can't be done and may be difficult to do, will actually end up undermining corporate ambition, because it's going to remove the envelope that corporates currently have that's essentially that liability I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, that allows them to use an offset to address that liability. Now, it's not a liability on their books per se, but essentially when you create your footprint, you're saying, here's my footprint. And in the world we live today, you got to do something about that. So if you reduce your footprint and you have a residual amount of emissions left, you can use an offset to address that. So our concern is that if you force a corresponding adjustment, you then end up the contribution claim is not going to address that business imperative to reduce that footprint. And if you require a corresponding adjustment, then you're putting the brunt of this on many of the developing countries. So look at this. In this room, in this webinar, who do we have? People here who have benefited from governments who've been able to provide the infrastructure and the needs for us to have health, education, shelter, and food, right? By requiring a corresponding adjustment, you're shifting that requirement, that brunt, onto developing countries. And you're essentially asking Malawi or Guatemala, wherever it may be, to now find an extra emission reduction in their economy when they might prefer to actually spend it on health, education, and even shelter and food for their countries. So I think that's really problematic from the sustainable development perspective to be foisting this onto developing countries when in fact they might benefit from this, from voluntary carbon markets. And it's a really important tool. So I think there's two elements to that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is probably very provocative material, your idea that corresponding adjustments should be voluntary for the voluntary carbon market. And I will invite the other speakers to respond to that later. But let's first turn to Gilles Dufrasne from Carbon Market Watch. Gilles, there will have been a few surprises in what you heard. You probably weren't in for agreement from the two standards that the core carbon contract of the voluntary, the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets is a good thing. And you probably want to take issue too with what David Antonioli just said about corresponding adjustments, but over to you to follow your own flow of thoughts.
Sure, yeah, thanks very much, Sabine, and thanks for the interesting comments and conversation we've had so far. We have not so much time left, so I'm going to be very brief as I can, and just outline some of the other thoughts we have on these topics. First, going right into the discussion around corresponding adjustments. We do think corresponding adjustments are necessary for all credits for various reasons, and I think Owen has outlined many good reasons already. And I think the main one is the risk that you could be replacing host country action. It doesn't mean that you are necessarily going to always replace host country action. So that's a fair point, I think, from David, that there's no direct logic. It's not automatic. But to us, the fact that the risk exists, and we think the risk is material, it's definitely a credible scenario that this might happen, is enough to justify the need for corresponding adjustments. Also, I would like to point out that we talk about the difference between Paris Agreement and Kyoto Protocol, and the fact that now all countries have targets, which is of course very true. But under the Kyoto Protocol, some countries did have targets, of course. And so I find it interesting to look at what were the rules and the provisions under the Kyoto Protocol for those countries that did have targets. And the rules from both Gold Standard and Verra are that countries cannot use those emission reductions from the voluntary market towards meeting their own targets. It's not always for the same reasons as under the Paris Agreement, but I think the logic is very comparable, and so I don't see any reason to kind of move from the solution that was under the Kyoto Protocol and find something different under the Paris Agreement. Now, moving on from that, we do see a need for developing alternatives to offsets, alternatives to compensation. This is something we've been advocating for a long time. In part, this is because we think the way offsets work today still opens the door much too wide for greenwashing and for making claims that aren't always true. And so we need to have a claim that better reflects what is actually happening. I think a contribution claim would achieve that by making it clear that a company is contributing to climate effort, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it cancels out the effectiveness of the product or the impact of a product or some activities. I hear the argument that this would undermine company action because it basically means companies are not interested in the contribution claim and they wouldn't want to buy it. I don't think this undermines climate action. I think what this undermines are efforts by companies to try to make their products look greener than they actually are. Because with a contribution claim, you don't undermine in any way the flows of financial transfers. The only thing you change is the way companies will communicate around those credits, and they would no longer be able to say that a certain product has no impact on the climate, such as selling fossil fuels, so, for example. And so it's more about correcting advertisements and better matching reality. So I think it would only harm those companies who are using offsets merely as a PR tool and who are not really about ambition. Because if you are only about ambition and want to help developing countries, you shouldn't really care about what claim you can make and how much this is going to help you in your advertising campaign. And then just one last point to close rapidly. We do think the contribution claim is a good idea. We also think there might be other avenues to look into. For example, practice-based credits could be something to think about more and discuss in the carbon market community. We could think about paying for certain practices, for example, paying farmers or other practitioners for certain practices, not necessarily quantifying it on a ton per ton basis. I think one of the benefits of this would be in particular for projects that are subject to non-permanence risk. It would really make it a lot more clear that once you stop the payments, there's a risk that the benefits you have achieved might just go away. So if you buy results-based credits, then you think whatever reduction or whatever carbon is stored is going to stay there forever, which sometimes is not the case. Whereas if you pay for practices, it's a lot more clear that once your financial transfers end, there is a risk that the practice might end as well, and therefore that the benefits might disappear. It doesn't mean they will necessarily, but the risk is clearly there. So I'm not going to talk any longer. Just noting that we have just published a policy briefing on this, and it gives a lot more detail on possible alternatives to offsetting, and also goes into more detail on the question of double counting and explains why we think corresponding adjustments are needed. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Gilles, for this counter statement to what we've heard from David Antonioli, providing a lot of food for discussion. We have 20 minutes left for debate and so much to cover. I'm struggling to find a structure in my head for it, but I think the wisest is maybe to go back to the presentation of Guy Turner, because we've had some questions specifically addressed to Guy. One of the questions was about the connection between the task force for scaling up voluntary markets and Article 6. Why is the task force actually working towards the Glasgow COP next year? Why is there involvement already from the COP preparation team? There is the climate champions team of the COP machine looking at making these linkages between companies and government efforts. How does it all actually hang together? Guy, can you explain this to us?
It's a very good question, actually, and it's a very topical question. And it's something that we've been involved with ourselves. I think the question on the chat was, why was it out of scope of the TSVCM to start with? And my response to that was, I wasn't around at the time when the decision was made, but or involved with it. But I think it was probably the right thing, because the task force is really focused on the activities that need to work and be improved within the industry of the voluntary carbon market. And as David has said, there are arguments to say that the industry and the process of corporate commitments and channeling that money into good projects can and should continue outside and irrespective of what governments decide they should or shouldn't do. And the more that it gets tied up in that, in this world, the more I think it just gets bogged down. So that's not to say the linkages need and don't exist. They are there and they are important. It's such a larger problem that involves government considerations. It involves Article 6 discussions. It's not something that the industry, the offsetting industry, carbon finance industry, can resolve itself. So I think they can move much quicker. They can knock down more skittles by not having it within their scope, and then the thorny issue that we're talking about today can be addressed in parallel to what they're doing. And I think that just accelerates the whole process. And I think it was probably a smart decision on their part to do that. If I could just take the microphone, and we will be releasing a report on this very shortly, because we've spoken to a lot of participants on this. And I hear Owen and I hear David, Gilles and Aki and then Sabine, and I've taken a lot of views, and I actually think there's common ground. And I actually think there's perhaps violent agreement on a number of issues which are not perhaps being aired. And I think the common ground is an issue that is lost sometimes in the simplification of these issues, is the status of economic development of the countries, of the host countries. So when we're talking about an NDC is not like a cap under the Paris Agreement. It's not like a cap under the Kyoto Protocol or the California Cap and Trade Scheme or the EU ETS, where there are hard sanctions in place. And therefore, whatever a country says it's going to do, it will and must do, or face severe penalties. It's a more fluid concept. It's even more fluid and nuanced the further you go down the development curve. So if you're talking about Switzerland setting an NDC target, or Germany, and then a voluntary carbon project being done in that project, there's probably a better argument for displacement of national intentions and national rules and regulations. Getting down into the developing world and the least developed countries, their ability to set a target in the first place, let alone their ability to set rules and regulations and then enforcement, is so much different that the concept of a hard and fast target and the displacement effect of a voluntary activity displacing what a government may or may not do, I think is a different argument. So I think if I was to sort of take Gilles and Owen's view about the need for a corresponding adjustment, I would say that is you want to move out of a Germany or a Switzerland, there's a strong case for that. If you're talking about a least developed country where they're struggling to do the basics, the British government sends 30 people to the COP. Some countries send half a person to the COP. They literally have very, very few capacity, a little limited capacity to enforce this on the ground. David, the more times that we actually understand what it's like to do a project, in the depths of Brazilian rainforest or in the Indonesian forest, and trying to sort of police and enforce the higher policies that they may have set, is is a difference. And I think the solution space is, and I don't want to get into Annex 1 and non-Annex 1, but it's sort of along the same spectrum. I think that there is a need for private capital to be contributing to what those developing countries are trying to do, and should, I think there's an argument for sort of recognizing that in terms of the carbon, the carbon calculation as well. But it's not the same the higher you go up the development curve. So I think just want to throw that out and get some responses to that, and see how people react.
Yeah, no, thanks, Guy. That's a very thoughtful contribution. I wanted to go back to the issue about the Carney Task Force, because I too have been on it, as has Owen, and to the question about why has it been out of scope. I think in some ways, my bet, or certainly the draft report that came out and people may have commented on, sets out that a corresponding adjustment is something that's optional for the buyer to require. So you'll have a set of core carbon principles that will be established based on, the things that we know, right? Whether the programs that are accepted under this system have rules to require, clear and transparent accounting methodology that set out requirements on additionality, permanence, third-party auditing, all that stuff, the governance of the organization, provisions on public consultation. There's also requirements on the registry. So all that stuff that kind of standards do kind of is part of the core carbon principles, but there are other additional elements that can be added on. And so certainly in the draft report, the need for, or the option for having a corresponding adjustment is an optional feature that the buyer can decide to require if they so choose. So that, along with, whether you want to require reporting on sustainable development benefits or other optional attributes, have been kind of parked in that department and not as part of the core carbon principles. And I think that's the right decision. But I mean, getting back to, sorry, I just want to clarify that I think the task force has, in a way, answered that question, but it's basically said, well, work over here, let's get the core carbon principles, make sure that the credits have legitimacy or have integrity, and then other issues that may differ based on the buyer's preferences can get sorted out that way. But again, I don't want to lose the train of thought of what you raised, Guy, about countries not being able to provide the basic needs for their populations. That's kind of what I was driving at. I mean, I think it's unfair to require, again, the example I had was Mali, Guatemala, you can name any country you want, to force them to find another emission reduction in their economy based on a tool that's created for reporting at the national level when a company is willing to do this on a voluntary basis. And that means that they have to spend their resources to find that other emission reduction in their economy when they could very well be spending that on other things that their population might need, which means that the whole corresponding adjustments may be very hard to come by. And so
if I could jump in. Yeah, I'm not so sure that, and then sort of buy into that argument totally. I think that if there is a corresponding adjustment, and then for, from a voluntary transaction, and therefore they need to move their emissions up, and therefore they have to sort of the same distance to target, that they still have the ability to choose how they spend their money, and also they should have the ability to choose where they set their target in the first place. So it should be net. It should be sort of net no change if there's a corresponding adjustment. My point is, very few countries in the lower end of even the developed countries sometimes, their ability to predict what their target should be and how they're going to actually go ahead and achieve it is really minimal in a lot of cases. And so I think it's not that they would be forced into spending scarce capital on CO2 reductions rather than health or social services. It's just the ambiguity around what that target means in the context of their country, their inability to make sort of calculations and set policies and regulations and enforcement processes gives a lot more wiggle room for external capital to be used in a way that governments can't use it.
I think.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you, David. You've both referred to the good intentions behind the Mark Carney task force, but I want to ask Owen, is this actually, despite the good intentions that we know about of the task force, is this a good time to promote the scaling up of the market? What are the risks of scaling up too many problems that are currently inherent in the market, Owen?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I think it speaks. So I thought, Gilles, you articulated the material significant risk point very well, which is the one that the corresponding adjustment conversation centers upon, and it's, to me, it seems absurd to say that we would scale a market by an order of magnitude with that risk inherent and not assume that it can't, or assume that it won't affect anybody else's behavior, that host countries won't receive that signal in some way. And we know that carbon market projects are visible in national accounting. That's been studied in regards, or with regards to the CDM. You know, Gold Standard itself was involved in something like 14% of Turkish renewable energy. You know, that stuff does affect policy, right? It does affect the way countries behave. Obviously it does. It would be absurd to argue it doesn't. And I struggle a little bit with it's the buyer's decision, or it's the buyer's preference in the Carney task force, because what that argument then says is the risk that Gilles and Aki and I perceive and consider to be true becomes irrelevant because the buyer would rather it wasn't true. That just doesn't make any sense, right? It's completely incoherent. And so the conclusion has to be it either is or it isn't true. And if that risk is there, you need to deal with it. But what the buyer feels about that risk doesn't change that risk. And I think that is inherently the biggest risk in scaling, because when you scale something that has that problem will grow and grow and grow, and the bad smell will continue around it. I think on the LDC point, I agree with what you're driving at there, Guy. I don't think we should be condescending, not that you were, but we shouldn't be condescending. A lot of LDCs will have capacity to think like that. I don't think it's about giving up assets necessarily. I think it's about intelligently bringing them forward, and we need to help countries do that. But I think the bigger risk to LDCs is not addressing this problem in developed countries, because they will now compete with those old annex target setting countries. They will effectively be competing with those because those countries don't need some sort of adjustment anymore if we go down that path. And that actually, I think, is a big risk to LDCs getting this finance. So if you can suddenly easily do a project in the EU because we don't require any regulation of that, then people will buy that. And because it's easier to do, it's more directly on their doorstep, and a lot of buyers will prefer that. We see that all over the US at the moment. So I do think it's a big risk. I think the risk is the other way around, that we scale a market that becomes easier to do in high income countries, and LDCs get left behind through that way instead. So Sabine, to your question, I think, you know, scaling is, we said on a forum the other day, right? Scaling is just a valueless term. If you scale rubbish, you're still just gonna have big rubbish. So you have to address these risks so that when you scale up, they don't become really pernicious market wrecking problems, I suppose. But I agree with Guy. I mean, and that's actually Gold Standard's policy, is that we will roll out corresponding adjustments for offsetting on a staggered basis, starting with higher income countries first. We don't foresee a period when it's going to be possible in the old Kyoto targeted countries to issue credits unadjusted, and they'll come into force at kind of over time as we descend down the economic ladder from there. Can I ask Owen a question? Am I allowed to, Sabine?
Very quickly, I have another question in store for Aki to return to the idea of results-based climate finance, but please.
Well, it's so David and Owen, well, all the panel really. Just in terms of the response back to the kickback to the corporates and what their demand is likely to be for a corresponding adjustment credit, the corresponding adjustment process will actually create a liability on the government. If that project is not 100%, if they can't be guaranteed the additionality of that project, they're basically underwriting the carbon liability of that project at a national level. And is there a risk that governments will then want some kind of financial reassurance from the project, i.e. like a tax, whatever it is, to, you know, China put a CDM tax on all of the export of CDRs and when it did it. And would that then start to raise the price of a corresponding adjustment credit to the point that the companies, corporates who are making those net zero commitments are starting to look at the price differential between a CA and non-CA adjusted credit and thinking, well, that one comes with a full carbon offset claim, that one comes with a contribution claim. Now I'm actually going to adjust my corporate strategy and the claims I set against them because of this price differential.
Yeah, I think so, Guy. I think there's lots of connotations there. Like I say, I think David's right that, you know, one size fits all, it doesn't suit the nuance. There's lots of things. I mean, corruption is another issue there, right? Like you could have two identical projects, one gets a corresponding adjustment, one doesn't, and questions start to arise from that. So we have to be super careful on a number of fronts with these mechanisms. My view is to be honest, that the compensatory model, so the bigger iceberg in a way is double claiming amongst companies as value chain targets start to overlap with each other and overlap with the carbon market, and then that double claim becomes very difficult to police and manage. So I think what we'll see is, as you say, correspondingly adjusted units, you know, just because of their market flexibility and access, become more valuable, and if you know the claims are differentiated, what you'd hope then is behavior to follow that, as you suggest. My view is actually that, and this is very much personal view, not gold standard policy view, is that because of that increasing double claim with countries, but even more so the increasing double claim with things like science-based targets, offsetting will become more and more difficult to achieve. But that's not a bad thing, right? That's surely on the road to resolving the emergency as all of these things start to overlap. That's a signal of winning, I would think, rather than necessarily a problem. But it is a problem if you really, really want to make your claim offset. Absolutely.
I want to, we're talking here a lot about making assumptions of what buyers actually want, what companies are looking for. In this context, I want to refer to a recent study by the Wuppertal Institute that has looked at the climate policies of large multinational companies, and they found that, yeah, while 2/3 of the companies they looked at explicitly already target offset use, there is also a small minority that explicitly excludes offset use, and then there is a third that is completely undecided on the issue. And question to Aki here in particular, what's the chance of winning those companies over to the concept of results-based climate finance, while they haven't established a policy yet of using offsets? So question of that to Aki, but I know that also Gilles wants to comment briefly on the issue of what buyer preferences might be, and then we'll have to wrap up.
I'm hopeful. I can say that at NewClimate, we apply an internal carbon price to our own emissions. And with that, we actually put euros aside in a separate account based on our emissions. And we use that to support projects where we are definitely reducing emissions, or we have the expectation. We'll come out with a little announcement shortly about what we're supporting. That if you measure those emissions, those are probably much larger than our actual carbon footprint. But by applying that internal carbon price, you're breaking that fungibility between is it cheaper to reduce elsewhere, and am I thereby reducing an incentive to reduce my own emissions? I think there are some promising discussions happening in the Science-Based Targets Initiative, where there is very lively discussions about the extent to which offsets can be used in science-based targets. And there's a clear distinction between one's own emissions and the extent to which one can net them off, and be still sort of in line with the science-based trajectory. And to the extent that the incentive of sort of those corporate claims can still provide carbon finance through results-based finance. I do think that is corporate philanthropy is something that's growing, and it is something that's good for PR. Jeff Bezos and the large amounts of finance that Amazon is putting forward are not directly related to the carbon footprint of Amazon. I think there's a lot of opportunity out there for corporates to contribute to finance in a way that's not directly related to netting off their own carbon footprints.
Thank you, Aki. Gilles, a quick final word from you.
Yeah, just very quickly, because I recognize we're over time already. But just on the question of buyer preferences, I think there's an assumption under all this discussion, which I think is pretty strong, which is that buyers will actually understand what we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about corresponding adjustments to prevent a risk that's not really a risk of double counting, but also a risk of incentives and additionality. Like, we're talking about ourselves knowing, or knowing to a fair extent how the market is operating. I don't think we can expect that from buyers, and so that's why that's the main concern I have with the labeling approach, is that the buyers will just not understand what it means to have a corresponding adjustment or not. So that's something we need to keep in mind, and at least do a lot of capacity building and then information exchange on that question.
Thanks a lot, Gilles. Well, what can I conclude? I can mostly conclude that we don't have consensus yet on a lot of issues, and that the future does yet hold a lot of certainties. There certainly isn't clarity yet that sometime soon results-based climate finance will replace offsets. Where offsets are concerned, we don't have unity of opinion that corresponding adjustments need to be made and need to be asked for also by the buyers, by the corporates. There are lots of issues we haven't even, that were just thrown in that we haven't been able to pick up on. David Antonioli, for example, projected that nature-based credits stemming from nature-based solutions will increase in significance and will be the last ones to be regulated. That alone would be worth a whole webinar, I guess. Well, you've all looked into the crystal ball. You've tried your best, but yeah, we still have to decide individually what do we want to believe in and what cause we want to adhere to. So excitement remains as we go into 2021. And even if we haven't resolved all the issues, I'd like to thank you very much for presenting your respective views and for throwing out there what is at stake in the remaining international negotiations and the various efforts to bring clarity and order to carbon markets, be they the compliance one or the voluntary one, and the interconnections between them. As the organizer of this webinar, allow me to just point out that there is the results-based climate finance study, which Carbon Market Watch commissioned from NewClimate Institute on our website, and also our latest briefing entitled Above and Beyond Carbon Offsetting. And while these might be slanted in a particular direction, I hope you welcome them as a contribution to these difficult debates. Apologies to all the comments and questions from the participants that I have not done justice in this short time, but we will certainly look at them afterwards and see how we can take the materials forward into future debates. A very warm thank you to all the speakers, to the participants. Have a very good end of year break, and keep the debate alive as we go into 2021. Thank you very much.